Hello, my name's Sawyer Gilding. I'm a master's student at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee in the Department of Communication, and I am mostly focusing on rhetoric. And the reason why I mention this is because this video is going to be analyzing homophobic rhetoric from the past and present in American society and trying to forge a link between the older, more, I guess, classic forms of homophobic rhetoric that have pretty thoroughly been critiqued and cast out as acceptable opinions in American society. I'm going to be comparing that rhetoric to current, incredibly harmful and popular rhetoric surrounding the LGBTQ2 plus community, specifically gender nonconforming individuals and specifically trans individuals. So that's essentially what we're going to be talking about today in this video. And to start out, I have to admit that I haven't really done this before. I've never made a video essay. I've actually just only written regular essays. And so I'm kind of structuring it in the same way, but a little differently, and you'll notice that pretty soon. And I guess that's a pretty good segue into how I'm going to be structuring this argument. We're going to begin with some definitions and kind of a literature review portion of this virtual essay, this video essay. And essentially what a literature review is taking the research or the argument or whatever you are writing in your essay and kind of placing it in the context of pre-existing scholarly research on definitions, methods, these sorts of things. And so today I'm going to start by kind of positioning how I'm going to be talking about these topics with some actual literature that is either tangentially related to homophobic rhetoric in the past or just argumentation rhetoric in general. And so to start off, I'm going to begin with a few definitions here. The main definition that I really want to get out of the way first, which actually isn't the subject of this analysis, but more so a very important context, and that would be hegemony. So the idea of hegemony, if you're not aware, and if you are aware, I'm sorry that I'm going to explain it because I'm sure there are many people who aren't aware of the concept of hegemony. Specifically in this video essay, I'm going to be talking about hegemonic heterosexuality and at times like hegemonic masculinity. But the idea of hegemony that I'm referencing is coming from Antonio Gramsci. He was an Italian activist, politician, thinker who was imprisoned by Mussolini's government and actually died due to his imprisonment. But in prison, he wrote a lot of really, really great literature on topics like hegemony, and that's actually where Gramsci's hegemony comes from. And it's based on a kind of Marxist, mechanical, historical materialism. And so specifically to Gramsci and to those who follow his line of thinking, hegemony is the cultural, moral, and ideological leadership of one group over either allied groups or subaltern groups. So basically, there's a leader and it's leading over people who support that leadership as well as individuals who do not. And that would be the subaltern groups. So to begin putting this context of what we're going to be talking about today together, I just wanted to start with that idea of hegemony and specifically hegemonic heterosexuality. And the way that I'm connecting like regular bare bones hegemony to hegemonic heterosexuality is if you think about sexuality on a spectrum, which is as far as we know how sexuality exists, then you can tell like it's a spectrum. It's not a pyramid or something more hierarchical. And so the concept of hegemonic heterosexuality, which still is pretty pervasive in the world that we live in, is that heterosexuality is actually hegemonic. So it's taking the leadership role, and everything else, every other sexuality is then subaltern to hegemonic heterosexuality. And so to kind of take a step back and talk about like why I think this is important to make as a connection of rhetoric over like time period of, old school homophobic propaganda from the 60s to modern day elected officials and politicians and speakers, public speakers, talking about trans individuals and LGBTQ individuals in general as predators or dangerous or needing to be reanalyzed in our society. It kind of ties back to a very basic idea. And so I'm going to be quoting from Ralph R. Smith and Russell R. Winds, actually from their book Pro-Gay, Anti-Gay. It's about the rhetorical war over sexuality. But they, in that book, say language is central to the process of public debate over social change, and that those who have the power to establish the language of public debate will have tremendous advantage in determining that debate's outcome. So breaking it down into the context of what we're talking about, those who structure the debate over sexuality and over whether or not, LGBTQ2 plus people are even allowed in society, if they're structuring the debate with that in mind, with that ideological bent, then the whole debate is kind of doomed to fail. And so in doing this research and presenting this to you, I'm hoping to illustrate the ways in which this rhetoric has not really changed much, even though it seems a lot different from the early days of actual homophobic propaganda in the 50s and 60s. Essentially, it's very similar and hopefully can be combated using the same techniques. And so framing this whole discussion, other than hegemony, one of the most important concepts, two of them actually, are dissociation and association. And so to give a little background, dissociation is a rhetorical tactic through which a speaker creates a distinction between a potentially otherwise unitary concept in the minds of the audience. The speaker is not subject to a limit of strategy in this process, and they can attribute importance, validity, positivity, any of these kind of positive traits to one, and insignificance, falsity, and negativity to the other. But a central aspect of this is that it doesn't have to be this way. So to dissociate two concepts, one doesn't have to be positive and the other negative. They just have to be separate in some way. They are still tied together by their definition. So a central aspect of dissociation is distinction, because through distinction, a notion that the audience regards as a conceptual unit is split up into two new notions, each comprising a part of the original one. Now, kind of jumping the gun here, and I don't want to get too far ahead, but if you think about an example of this type of dissociation, breaking a concept up and assigning maybe positive notions to one and negative to the other, we can think about heterosexuality, and that's going to come up a lot later. But sexuality in general, as I already noted, exists on a spectrum. And so if you grow up your whole life learning this and just saying okay, there's some people who are attracted to these people and some people are attracted to the opposite sex, that type of knowledge, if you have that background, then in order to create hegemonic heterosexuality, you would have to dissociate heterosexuality from any other type of sexuality. And that is what is done often in homophobic rhetoric. Homophobic rhetors are separating heterosexuality, which they assign as positive, normal, non-deviant, and any other sexuality, and in the old days, mostly just homosexuality, as not the normal sexuality and therefore deviant and all of these other negative traits. Dissociation also involves definition because as a result, the original term is newly defined, and alongside the old one, a new term is called into being. This receives a definition of its own, or the old term is replaced by two new terms, each with their own definition. Here we can see in the example of heterosexuality as being split apart, dissociated from homosexuality, there's a level of associations that take place and the definitions therein, but they are kind of connected at their core. By creating this binary of ideas, we have heterosexuality, which is positive, normal, biologically necessary to repeat the species, and homosexuality or any other variant of sexuality, which is therefore not normal, deviant, and not necessary. It's just purely hedonistic because you're not, you know, bringing about new members of the human race. So in this project, there are a few specific dissociative structures that I'll be looking at. And also, as a piece of context, I'm using Perlman and Albrecht's Titeka, the New Rhetoric. This is where I'm getting all of my dissociation and association rhetoric. For the most part, I have a few other sources I'm referencing. That is a book from the 1960s, so it's a pretty foundational book when it comes to rhetoric analysis and argument analysis. So, as I mentioned, we're going to be focusing on a few examples from Perlman and Albrecht's Titeka's The New Rhetoric, and a few of them are primarily appearance and reality, apparent impartiality, real impartiality, sensible knowledge, and rational knowledge. So, the dissociation of appearance reality, in the book, they reference a straw going into a glass of water. So the appearance of the straw is that it bends when it hits the water. The reality is that it's light refracting, and so there is a dissociation between what is appearing to be real and what is actually happening and what is actually existent. So the other ones that I'm bringing into this are apparent impartiality versus real impartiality. And these are not as much tactics that are being used by homophobic writers, but ways we can understand the dissociation within the homophobic rhetoric and like its context. So apparent impartiality versus real impartiality is used a lot by homophobic writers by saying essentially that they are, a person that we're going to be talking about later in the video, Anita Bryant, famously has a quote where she essentially says that she doesn't hate gay people, she just doesn't want them to negatively impact her children. And then the real impartiality is just would be not saying that, not hating gay people and also not constructing them as a threat. And then there's sensible knowledge and rational knowledge. And a lot of the time, homophobic writers will appeal to sensible knowledge, where, naturally, because like we'll see in a actual propaganda video later in this video, essentially what is being said is that homosexual individuals cannot procreate and thus need to recruit. And if you don't think about it much, or if you're unfamiliar with the topic, then you think like, oh, okay, that makes sense. I guess if I'm being paranoid about my children, maybe this is like a thing I should be worried about, versus rational knowledge, which would be looking at research and seeing that there is no direct correlation with homosexuality and, predatory behaviors, especially to children. Translated into the subject matter of this study, we can rename them appearance of homosexuals in mass media versus reality of homosexuals in daily life, apparent impartiality of rhetorics supporting hegemonic heterosexuality versus real impartiality regarding sexuality, sensible knowledge, versus rational knowledge would be sensible knowledge of the threats that homosexuals provide to society, and rational knowledge would be, as I just mentioned, that you're looking at studies and not basing your beliefs off of just fear. So sexuality and hegemony, as we've discussed in rhetoric surrounding sexuality, there's almost always a association and dissociation inherent. If we were discussing sexuality and sexual orientation in a open and free society, then we would know that all sexualities are on a spectrum. In the book, Queer Theory and Communication, From Disciplining Queers to Queering the Disciplines, author Gust A. Yep discusses the heteronormative attempts at dissociation of sexuality in order to solidify the definition of heterosexuality. Putting it pretty plainly, Yep writes, heterosexuality is not an independent and stable master category, but rather a subservient and unstable construct in need of constant affirmation and protection. Unlike popular conceptions of gender and racialized identities in dominant culture that are based on the presumption that difference is written on the body and therefore serves as a biological proof of such categories, there is neither definitive or ultimate proof of heterosexuality. So here we see Yep outlining how the concept of dominant sexuality is not tied inherently to any observable reality. Rather, it must be hegemonically constructed and therefore reinforced. Yep then discusses the fact that there exists in large numbers examples of supposedly heterosexual individuals that marry, bear children, and only later in life confess their true sexuality that falls outside of the heterosexual category. Judith Butler in Bodies That Matter writes that in order for heterosexuality to maintain hegemonic status, it must exert great energy to do so. She writes, precisely because it can be faked, heterosexuality must anxiously, repeatedly, and persistently set about trying to affirm itself, assure itself, defend itself, and insist on itself. This is done through a vast network of methods, many of which construct the foundational pieces of homophobic rhetoric and propaganda that we will look at in the analysis portion of this video. One of the framings of homophobic rhetoric is that of special rights. So this would mean that every individual is free to practice their sexuality in private, but there is no room in the public sphere for any other sexuality than heterosexuality. The argument of special rights is then hinged on the point that non-heterosexualities, for them to be accepted, would require special rights because they're deviant by nature of not being normal, by nature of not being heterosexual. And so because they're deviant and because these are not socially acceptable practices, they would require special rights to be publicly, acknowledged. As Smith and Wins say in the pro-gay, anti-gay book, they defend this special rights position with the association of homosexuality and sin, as well as seduction of children. By creating and reinforcing this association, anti-gay rhetorics are both associating non-heterosexuals and dissociating heterosexuals with deviancy. This holds up to almost no scrutiny when looking at what I brought up before, which is sensible knowledge and rational knowledge. The difference between just assuming like, oh yeah, they're deviant, so of course they're a threat to children, versus actually doing the research and looking at the statistics of, child abuse among different communities. So the rhetoric of hegemonic heterosexuality is almost always tied to a belief in hegemonic masculinity or chauvinism, which is basically the ideology that feminism is a reaction to. In this way, we can read hatred or prohibition of homosexuality as an attempt to protect the roles of men and women in society. This rhetoric is often painfully obvious in homophobic rhetoric from the past, but it's a little bit muddier in the present because of the great strides that have been made to promote gender equality between men and women. And so because of that social change and the women's liberation movement, a lot of this rhetoric surrounding hegemonic heterosexuality has kind of become muddied a little bit and not as apparent in modern day homophobic and transphobic rhetoric. But in the past, it's painfully obvious. And in the book Right-Wing Women, feminist author Andrea Dworkin writes on this phenomena, all of the prohibitions further the aims of male dominance in the patriarchal tribe and contribute to the stability of male power. This means that it is foul to do to other men what men habitually, proudly, manfully do to women. Use them as inanimate, empty, concave things, subordinate them through sex. This presents the association that anti-gay rhetorics are creating that in our current context with the strides that have been made to, promote acceptance of cis male homosexuality and cis female lesbianism. This is kind of a weak point in this argument, considering the strides that have been made by, activists and other advocates of LGBTQ2+ rights over the past 30, 40 years, if not longer. So now I'm going to get to the analysis portion of this video. And now that we've established some of these definitions and theoretical contexts, we're going to analyze a few examples of homophobic rhetoric, starting in, I think, 1961 with a propaganda film made for children about gay individuals and homosexuality in general. And then we're going to move forward throughout 70s, 80s, 90s to our modern context, where we see an upsurge of discussions of grooming and kids being indoctrinated by some sort of gender ideology, is a term you'll hear a lot. And so I'm kind of at once trying to show how these processes happened and also understand how the rhetoric is relatively unchanged throughout that timeline. The first content that we're going to be looking at on this horrible tour of homophobic and anti-trans rhetoric comes from a propaganda film from 1961, been termed a guidance film. It's titled Boys Beware, and is formatted to serve as an educational piece of propaganda to associate homophobia with other values being instilled in America's youth. Due to the fact that this is a video, I'm going to actually be including part of it in this video. There's essentially a lot going on here. There's a few vignettes where essentially a boy experiences like an interaction with a man, and there's various outcomes. I'm only going to be including one. The entire video is only about 10 or 11 minutes long, so it's not quite long as a video. But I'm going to only be including one of them because I feel like they all kind of say the same thing, and then we'll discuss it afterward.
I'm Lieutenant Williams, a police officer attached to the Juvenile Division. I'm on my way to Monroe Junior High School to talk to a group of young people. That looks innocent enough, doesn't it? Lots of young people hitchhike. Seems like a good way to get from one place to another. But sometimes there are dangers involved that never meet the eye. Let's take the case of Jimmy Barnes. Jimmy played baseball all afternoon, and he didn't feel like walking home, so he decided to thumb a ride. He'd done it 100 times before, and he didn't think anything was unusual when the driver struck up a friendly conversation. In fact, he seemed like a real nice guy. He asked Jimmy if he played baseball in the park often. Jimmy told him they practiced 3 times a week and played a rival group on Friday afternoon. The stranger was a good listener, too, and it only seemed minutes before they pulled up in front of Jimmy's house. When Jimmy got out, the stranger gave him a friendly pat. Then he told him he'd see him again, as he always drove by the park on his way home. Sure enough, the following day, when Jimmy finished playing ball, well, the man was there waiting. They stopped at a drive-in, and the stranger treated him to a Coke. During their conversation, he told several off-color jokes, but Jimmy had heard others before, and well, it made him feel big to so easily win the confidence of an older person. The following Saturday, they went fishing together. By now, they were using first names. Ralph said it was more friendly. Jimmy hadn't enjoyed himself so much in a long time. Then during lunch, Ralph showed him some pornographic pictures. Jimmy knew he shouldn't be interested, but, well, he was curious. What Jimmy didn't know was that Ralph was sick, a sickness that was not visible like smallpox, but no less dangerous and contagious, a sickness of the mind. You see, Ralph was a homosexual, a person who demands an intimate relationship with members of their own sex. But by now, Jimmy felt a fondness for Ralph, and they continued to go places together. Ralph was generous and took Jimmy many interesting places and did many nice things for him. He bought presents and even gave him money, but payments were expected in return. You see, Jimmy hadn't recognized Ralph's approach soon enough. When Ralph first asked Jimmy to go fishing alone, he should have discussed it with his parents or teacher. Finally, Jimmy told his parents, and they reported it to the juvenile authorities. Ralph was arrested, and Jimmy was released on probation in the custody of his parents.
So as we saw from that example, not only does this film create the association between homophobia and other positively viewed social values like general safety and responsibility, it also focuses quite heavily on creating an association between homosexuality and pedophilia, as well as generally predatory behavior. There's also, in context of this video, an appeal to authority present, as the film begins with the disclaimer that it was produced with the cooperation of the Inglewood Police Department and the Inglewood Unified School District. I wanted to play this because I believe it shows early examples of the connection between homosexuality and predatory behaviors, especially to children, and the fact that it was actually shown to school children in the format of it being an educational video when it's clearly just a propagandistic piece of film about homosexuals and trying to instill a fear about homosexuals in children, especially the fact that the video ends with the quote that says, "One never knows when a homosexual is about," actually making it sound like they're a monster. So moving a little bit forward in time, I'm going to be talking about someone named Anita Bryant, and I'm going to be actually referencing some material covered in a video by the creator ContraPoints, which was specifically about J.K. Rowling and her transphobic rhetoric, but spent a good deal of time talking about Anita Bryant, who I'm embarrassed to say I'd never heard of. Not that she's good or that I admire her in any way, but just considering the level of the significant role that she played in the reactionary movement to gay rights, she's just a pretty significant figure. And so I'm going to give a little background on her now, just in case you're unfamiliar with her. One of the most famous voices in the field of anti-gay activism during this time period that I'm looking at is Anita Bryant. She was a famous singer and spokesperson for Florida Orange Juice. She became a vocal critic of what she considered the homosexual agenda, though she in many statements discusses her problems with the homosexual lifestyle. She tended to focus a lot of her rhetoric on the predatory nature of homosexuals. And so I'm going to be playing a quote here from her, but she says essentially that she needs to save the children from homosexuality.
I have been blacklisted for exercising the right of a mother to defend her children and all children against their being recruited by homosexuals. Because I dared to speak out for straight and normal America, because I dared to challenge the immoral influences of homosexual recruiters and their protectors on the Metro Commission, I have had my career threatened.
So I want to take a moment to understand some of this rhetoric. She's using a few key tactics that I set up in the literature review portion of this video. And so a few of those are that homosexuals are both recruiters inherently, because obviously they can't reproduce, and that homosexuals are dissociated from normal Americans in her rhetoric. And she says this often. She says normal, straight Americans. This is like reinforced over and over. Moving on, I don't want you to forget about her rhetoric too much because we are going to be kind of coming back to it when we get later in this piece. but a very outspoken anti-gay activist who was essentially, in her day, blacklisted and lost her deal with Florida Orange Juice because of gay activism and showing the effects that that can have on pushing the narrative to a more accepting, common discussion of topics. While much headway has been made toward a greater acceptance of LGBTQ plus people in the United States and globally, many of the old homophobic rhetorical tactics remain present in modern day anti-trans and anti-gender nonconforming rhetoric. In 2021, there was a public allegation that a trans woman had exposed her penis to a group of women in LA's Wi Spa, which is a popular spa in LA's Koreatown. These allegations were immediately picked up by outlets like Fox News and spread to promote a fear of transgender individuals using locker rooms and bathrooms that don't correspond with the gender they were assigned at birth, but rather correspond with the gender identity that they exist under. Also, a little bit before that, in 2016, the General Assembly of North Carolina passed House Bill 2, which effectively barred trans individuals from using the restroom that fits their gender identity. And this is a very strong example of creating a fear, especially in a school kind of setting, that trans individuals, by nature of them being trans, are being deceptive and predatory. So, rhetoric surrounding this is stating that trans individuals are only doing this to gain access to the opposite sex bathroom, even though that doesn't make sense if you understand how trans identity even works. And also, just to focus on creating a fear associated with the concept of trans people in the minds of people who might otherwise not really be familiar with what a trans person even is, especially in 2016. So, staggered a few years after that whole panic and all of these bathroom bills that I'm sure if you're watching this video, you've probably heard of at least, we have a reinvigorated onslaught of anti-trans rhetoric, especially bathroom-centric legislation, a conservative moral panic surrounding LGBTQ2 plus individuals as groomers kind of came onto the scene. To understand this rhetoric, we must first understand what grooming even means. And according to the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, it is, quote, when someone builds up a relationship, trust, and emotional connection with a child or young person so that they can manipulate, exploit, and abuse them. So, considering this context and understanding of what grooming actually means, I'm going to be talking a little bit about what has been called the Don't Say Gay bill. So, in 2022, Florida, under Republican Governor Ron DeSantis, passed HB 1557, which has been dubbed by many as the Don't Say Gay bill. While there's no mention in the bill of the term grooming at all, it does say and prohibit classroom instruction by school personnel or third parties on sexual orientation or gender identity in kindergarten through third grade, or in a manner that is not age appropriate or developmentally appropriate for students in accordance with state standards. So while this bill itself does not mention the concept of grooming, Christina Pushaw, who is DeSantis's press secretary, tweeted regarding the backlash to this bill that, quote, the bill that liberals inaccurately call the Don't Say Gay bill would more accurately be described as an anti-grooming bill. So acknowledging that this is about the topic of grooming. And this is also in a context where we have other elected representatives like Georgia Congressperson Marjorie Taylor Greene, who have publicly stated, she tweeted this actually, that Democrats are the party of killing babies, grooming, and transitioning children, as well as pro-pedophile politics. So obviously this is much more extreme and much less centered around specifically homosexual individuals. But if we look back to the rhetoric from the propaganda film that we noted earlier, as well as the footage of Anita Bryant discussing how she wishes to protect children from being recruited by homosexuals, which is essentially the same thing as saying grooming is what homosexuals do and what gender nonconforming individuals do. And so here we can see the crux of the point of what I'm trying to get at in this video, which is that there is a key association and dissociation going on in homophobic rhetoric. The dissociation is always between whatever is socially acceptable at the time and anything that is potentially outside the realm or newly being accepted in society. So originally it was taking all sexualities and saying, well, heterosexuality is normal and homosexuality is not normal, and therefore this one's not deviant, this one's deviant, this one is biologically necessary, this one is not. All of these conclusions that you can come to with these dissociations. Now they're saying, these Redders are saying that, cisgender people, if they're gay, maybe they're okay. But if you're gender nonconforming, then it means that you are deviant, there's something wrong with you. And then in turn, we can associate all of these other negative aspects with one and positive with the other. And with association, as we saw through the rhetoric of the propaganda film, as well as Anita Bryant's rhetoric on homosexuality, which in her mind, I think was just cisgendered male and female homosexuality and lesbianism. So in association with that concept and the fact that you cannot procreate with same-sex procreation, I guess, that it must lead to recruiting. So the association between being gay and needing to recruit further into the gay community. Obviously, this is ignoring all of research about how sexualities develop in humans, but this is the rhetoric that's being used. And now we jump to this year. I mean, there's examples of it from this year, but a lot of the key ones that I'm looking at in this video essay are from 2022, which, isn't even fully a year ago, where these Redders are saying that transgender people, gender nonconforming individuals, and sometimes broadly the LGBTQ2 plus community, specifically in some circumstances, drag performers, are essentially associated with trying to recruit children, that even understanding that they exist can potentially recruit children into this ideology of gender or whatever they call it, and that generally this needs to be abated in order to protect children. There is an example of an organization known as Moms for Liberty, which sprang up in the last few years, which is incredibly militant in this aim to erase the idea of trans individuals, gender nonconforming individuals, LGBTQ2 plus in general individuals, as well as America's history of institutional racism and structural racism. They are militantly against this, and they are spreading across the country. In just a few years, their membership has grown. And so here's like a real world example, especially in tandem with DeSantis's bill, the Don't Say Gay bill. These are actual legislative actions and militant groups that are going around the country and attempting to erase all of the progress that has been made by gay rights activists over the past 40, 50 years. And so I thought it was key for my project to bring attention to this and pointing out how this rhetoric is so similar and the ways in which it structurally works on minds that are not ready to steer clear from it or reject it outright. And so I'd like to thank you for watching this video. It's my first. It's kind of rough, but I might be making more in the future. And if you have any ideas for topics, let me know.